Psalm 137 verse 3. Learning how to multiply. In what day soever I shall call upon thee, hear me. Thou shalt multiply strength in my soul. Psalm 137 verse 3, reframes. We have a tendency to view prayer in a very one-sided manner, as in things we ask of God. This mistaken notion can lead either to a complete self-absorption in which our prayer is nothing but the things we ask for, or a feigned humility in which we never ask and thus never receive. St. James says, quote, "You covet and have not, you kill and envy and cannot obtain. You contend and war and you have not, because you ask not. You ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may consume it on your concupiscences." James chapter 4 verses 2-3, reframes. The asking is thus not the problem, but rather the things we ask for, as far too often we ask for what we think we need, but in reality it is what we want. To request things of God is not only allowable, but good, for we stand in a position of absolute dependence on His benignity. Even further, He desires for us to have things like virtue and righteousness, gifts that He graciously gives and which we can grow in as we cooperate with the gift of His grace poured into the soul. The heresy of the prosperity gospel is obvious, but perhaps more pernicious and subtle than we realize, as we can apply similar principles to prayer in that we mistake consolations and the feelings of prayer and communion with God for the thing itself, much like the heresy mistakes material blessings for God's favor. St. Augustine counters this tendency with the reality. Quote, "You pray often if you often have a desire to pay homage to God by your actions. You pray always if you always have this desire, no matter how you may be otherwise employed." Arpi Quadrupani, Light and Peace, Part 1, Chapter 3, 14. Since this desire to pay homage to God exists in various employments beyond what might be popularly considered a formal act of prayer, it naturally also exists in circumstances both desired and unwanted. Quote, "Need we be surprised that St. Augustine often assures us that the whole Christian life is but one long, continual tending of our hearts towards that eternal justice for which we sigh here below? Our only happiness consists in ever thirsting for it, and this thirst is in itself a prayer. Consequently, if we always desire this justice, we pray always. Do not think it necessary to pronounce a great many words and to struggle much with oneself in order to pray. To pray is to ask God that His will may be done, to form some good desire, to raise the heart to God, to long for the riches He promises us, to sigh over our miseries and the danger we are in of displeasing Him by violating His holy law." Arpi Quadrupani, Light and Peace, Part 1, Chapter 3, 14. This continual tending of our hearts towards God's justice and His will means that prayer will persevere through both prosperity and poverty, through joy and sorrow, arising not from the circumstances themselves, but perhaps in spite of them. This kind of prayer anchors itself on God's promises and will, rather than on the consolations received. The psalmist has begun this psalm with effusions of praise to the Lord, his confession of God's greatness and majesty. In the first two verses, there have been 4 instances of the psalmist declaring what he will do. I will praise, confitebor. I will sing, psalm. I will worship, adorabo. I will give glory, confitebor. He now shifts from what he will do to what he wishes for the Lord to do. The psalmist uses the I will statements to frame what he intends, but now looks into the future, as it were, to frame how he desires for the Lord to respond. Looking forward to an unspecified day, he says, "In what day soever I shall call upon thee, hear me." The Vulgate has in quacumque die invocavero te exaude me, in which invocavero is the future perfect active indicative. In English, this is often rendered as the reframes does here, giving the sense of an action to be performed in the future. The more literal translation would be, "In what day soever I will have called upon you," thus describing a future action as if it is already completed. This is often implied in English by the use of shall, although we often use shall and will somewhat interchangeably for a future action. The upshot is that the psalmist's confidence in the Lord hearing him, as was already set forth in the opening passage, extends into the future, and he perceives the Lord hearing him as if he has already prayed. The English can give the sense that there is more of a contingency here, but in reality, the psalmist is expressing explicitly his assurance that God will hear. In the Old Latin that St. Augustine used, the word cito, quickly, is found directly before exaudime, rendering this first clause as, "In what day soever I will have called upon thee, do thou quickly hear me." As was noted earlier, the Christian life is the long, continual tending of the soul towards justice, and in the exile of this world, the temptations of the world and the flesh and the devil can press in hard upon us, such that it can seem there is no escape. For the soul that desires virtue, that virtue will be hard fought and hard won, but the prayer of the psalmist is that God will provide grace in the time of temptation and strength in the time of adversity to overcome them. Quote, "In what day soever I call upon thee, do thou quickly hear me. Wherefore quickly? Because thou hast said, while yet thou art speaking, I will say, Lo, here I am." Isaiah 58:9. Wherefore quickly? Because now I seek not earthly happiness. I have learnt holy longing from the New Testament. I seek not earth, nor earthly abundance, nor temporal health, nor the overthrow of my enemies, nor riches, nor rank. Naught of these do I seek. Therefore quickly hear me. Since thou hast taught me what to seek, grant what I seek. Let us say to this man, Askest thou aught of this kind? Let us hear, let him speak out his petition. Let us see what he seeketh. Let us learn of him to seek, that we may be thought worthy to receive. St. Augustine, Expositions on the Psalms, 137:7. St. Augustine explains this in light of the passage from Isaiah, that the very moment the prayer is offered, it is heard and answered. That is, when that prayer seeks not the things of this world, but aligns itself with God's will, asking for grace, asking for an increase in virtue, not centered on one's own desires, but rather setting one's mind on heavenly things. This is what prayer is meant to tend towards and meant to grow in, such that it becomes communion with and deeper union with God. Just as a father is pleased to give his children good things that are for their good when they ask, so our Father in heaven will give such things. Quote, "If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to them that ask him?" Matthew chapter 7, verse 11, Douay Rheims. The day in which the psalmist will pray is not simply a literal day in the future, but signifies a heart that is pure and not covetous for its own desires. That is, it seeks the Lord in the light, not feigning humility nor clouded with avarice, but coming before the Lord as a humble suppliant in the brightness of the light, knowing that all good things come from the Father of lights. Quote, "Here, day signifies a bright and sincere petition, which desire does not cloud nor any greed confound, but it radiates from that sun which cleanses all the darkness of mortality. In such petitions, therefore, the devout person prays to be heard, so that, being made complete by the power of the Lord, they may deserve to escape the snares of their persecutors." Cassiodorus, Explanation of the Psalms, 137:3. This gift of grace and an increase in virtue which the soul seeks in prayer is further elaborated in the concluding clause, "For God shall multiply strength in my soul." St. Jerome's Hebrew translation has dilatabis rather than multiplicabis, dilatabis meaning to expand or increase. This multiplication or increase is not something that comes from the psalmist's own doing or efforts, but is a direct result of God's action, for the psalmist cannot multiply or increase himself. In the previous passages, the psalmist used for I will statements, and now this is juxtaposed with an I will statement for God, in that thou shall or thou will multiply strength. It is because God will do this that the psalmist earlier used the future perfect for his prayer. His confidence in God's outpouring of strength in his soul is so great that any future prayer is as if it has already been answered. But this strength in his soul which is multiplied or increased is something that comes from God alone, and thus, as being necessarily fruitful, excludes evil desires or even desires for the good things of this world. St. Augustine notes that the first promise of multiplication was given to Adam and Eve, and this was a blessing from the Lord, but even this blessing of multiplication can be vexatious to men, and he adduces the examples of those who fear having too many children, and either expose them to death or give them to others. The same analysis can be applied to any of the things that belong to this world, no matter how good. Quote, "Seeing then there be many multiplications and many kinds of multiplications, what multiplication seeketh he who said, Quickly hear me? For he saith, Thou shalt multiply me. We wait to hear, wherein, Hear then, in my soul. Not in my flesh, but in my soul, thou shalt multiply me in my soul." Is aught further added, lest perchance even multiplication in soul signify not necessarily happiness? For men are multiplied in their soul with cares. A man seemeth to be multiplied in soul, in whom vices even are multiplied. One man is only avaricious, another only proud, another only luxurious, another is both avaricious and proud and luxurious. He is multiplied in his soul, but to his hurt. That is the multiplication of want, not of fullness. St. Augustine, Expositions on the Psalms, 137:8. The multiplication is thus not pertaining to worldly things or worldly desires, since this multiplication is in the soul. But neither can it be reduced to some sort of fullness of desire within the soul, for evil men perceive themselves to be happy when they are filled with vices and glutted by their own self-will, and thus not truly happy but rather loaded down by want. This multiplication, thus, is not something that arises from gaining the things of this world, nor of achieving one's own desires that arise from one's heart and will. As these are necessarily excluded, all that remains is an external source for this multiplication. Quote, "What then dost thou desire, thou who hast said, 'Quickly hear me,' and hast withdrawn thyself entirely from the body, from every earthly thing, from every earthly desire, so as to say to God, 'Thou shalt multiply me in my soul'? Explain yet further what thou desirest. 'Thou shalt multiply me,' saith he, 'in my soul with virtue.' His wish is fully stated, his longing fully stated, it is cut off from all confusion. Were he to say, 'Thou shalt multiply me,' thou mightest think he meant with some earthly things. He added, therefore, 'in my soul.' Again, lest thou shouldst think he spoke of vices in the soul, he added, 'with virtue.' Naught further is there which thou mayest long for from God, if thou wishest with a good and honest front to say, 'Quickly hear me.'" St. Augustine, Expositions on the Psalms, 137:8. This virtue is from the Latin anima mea virtutem, which can mean either strength in my soul or virtue in my soul. Virtus has the sense of strength or manliness, the ideal sum of all the perfections in a man. In a theological sense, virtus thus can be applied to the moral perfections in man. There is of course a strength to virtue, for in training oneself in virtue, one struggles against the allures and temptations of the flesh and the world and the devil, and grows into that virtue more and more, much like lifting weights strains against gravity, and in doing so strengthens the muscles of the body. In baptism, the theological virtues are infused into the soul, and as we cooperate with that grace in the exercise of that virtue, we can grow in sanctification and increase in virtue. Quote, "Know you not that they that run in the race all run indeed, but one receiveth the prize? So run that you might obtain. And every one that striveth for the mastery refraineth himself from all things. And they indeed that they may receive a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible one. I therefore so run, not as at an uncertainty, I so fight, not as one beating the air. But I chastise my body and bring it into subjection, lest perhaps, when I have preached to others, I myself should become a castaway." 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Douay Rheims. This becomes the prayer that the psalmist knows will always be heard, will always be answered, for the sanctification of the soul is God's desire. He will provide the grace to overcome temptation, to grow in virtue, and to persevere through the long and continual journey towards the heavenly kingdom. Quote, "What I earnestly beg of you is to multiply, which means to increase, not the number of my years, nor my wealth, nor my children, nor anything else of the sort, but strengthen my soul, so as to enable me to resist my evil desires, to bear all crosses with patience, to tread in the path of justice without fatigue, to offer violence to the kingdom of heaven, that thus I may ultimately come to him whom thou hast magnified." St. Robert Bellarmine, A Commentary on the Book of the Psalms, 137:3. "In what day soever I shall call upon thee, hear me. Thou shalt multiply strength in my soul." Psalm 137, verse 3, Douay Rheims.